Welcome to Inaudible. I'm your host, Jeremy Weiland. On this podcast, we discuss the weird, beautiful channeled messages found in the long tradition of contact with the Confederation of Planets in service to the one infinite creator. These messages articulate a philosophy of spiritual evolution, popularly known as the Law of One. We seek to provide an analysis and commentary on this philosophy described in these messages, identifying the common themes and grappling with the application of this information to our human lives. However, we are not counselors, gurus, or experts of any kind, so please evaluate our words in light of these shortcomings and use your own best judgment. Thanks for listening. And I am pleased to welcome to the podcast once more Steve Tyman. Hi, Steve. How you doing?
Pretty good, Jeremy.
Great. Well, thanks for joining us. We are really happy to have you here for the third and likely final installment of our deep dive into the archetypes. And I would encourage listeners and viewers to go watch the past two episodes that we've recorded in order to, get the feel for what we're trying to accomplish here. What our focus is going to be on this episode is the spirit cycle. That would be the major arcana cards, I think 15 through 21. Starting with the devil, what's popularly known as the devil, and ending with what's popularly known as the world. Of course, we're going to use Ra's terminology for these archetypes, but those are the archetypes we're dealing with. We might not deal so much with the cards as folks are used to, because especially, and Steve, correct me if you have a different impression of this, but when we get into the spirit cycle, we are getting into a domain of the archetypal mind that's even more abstruse and kind of difficult to reason about and imagine based on the sheer scope of what spirit entails. Is that kind of how you feel about it too, Steve?
I think so. In truth, the archetypes of mind and body are somewhat familiar to people, at least implicitly, if not explicitly, because they do, in a way, structure their daily lives. It's not quite so true of the spirit archetypes. So it requires a kind of different framework of imagination, if you will, to deal with them.
Yeah, that makes sense. Does that imply that whereas body archetypes would kind of be the most in the daily quotidian aspects of life, mind a little bit more removed, that spirit somehow, does that kind of sketch out the larger evolutionary trajectory of a mind body spirit complex in a way that mind and body don't, maybe?
I think that's true. Uh, it's as if you're taking finally a direct rather than an indirect approach to the whole question of spiritual evolution. And it entails a lot more responsibility on the part of the seeker. And it frankly is kind of uh, terrifying in a way, because you're thrown back upon yourself in a fairly radical way. The matrix of the spirit is a good point of departure with respect to that point, because it's also sometimes called the dark night of the soul. And if and there really aren't any everyday experiential correlates to that. You could say that a profound depression would be as close as you might be able to come. But the matrix of spirit throws you back upon yourself as an individuated entity staring into the abyss. And it's disorienting in a way that no other experience in life can possibly be. It's an existential disorientation not a personal one. So now you're not dealing with the issues that have cropped up in the course of your own personal experiences as you make your way through the daily experiences of life. It's facing up to the very unsettling experience of being an individuated entity in a vast infinite cosmos.
And in the same way, I suppose that Ra speaks of matrix of mind as kind of like this sort of like baseline container for consciousness. And correct me if you have a different interpretation, but this kind of way in which a given chapter of the evolution of consciousness has a kind of maybe not boundary, but a sense that there is like content to be provided, right? It is the receptor of content. Matrix of spirit is kind of sounds from your interpretation like it's sort of serving that, but in this much more refined and less like harder to reason about, for certain hard to reason about.
Yes, when we deal with mind, we're dealing with what is typically called consciousness. And when we deal with spirit, an issue of will or faith comes into play. But there's also the kind of underside of both of those considerations. Consider the other pole of faith. It would be despair. And between faith and despair, there's no middle ground. And so it's like when you enter upon the domain of spirit, you don't have any supports for your footing, so that you might consider yourself as one who takes a measured approach. You're thrown into the abyss, and now it's a question of finding yourself within that vastness, the vastness of the infinite, and being responsible for who you are totally. There are no givens here. Everything that you are is something that devolves to your responsibility.
Okay, so now I have a better understanding of what you meant by the way in which spirit really calls out the in some ways the impossible mystery of being an individuated entity, right? Because it sounds like what you are describing, that responsibility, is akin to the responsibility of the creator itself, in the sense that it is completely their will, completely their desire that factors into the fact of creation. And yet
Yes.
we find ourselves in that role, and we're totally unprepared for it, at least at first, I would imagine.
Yeah. If you try to frame it in terms of consciousness, it inevitably comes out as a paradox, because you're both the infinite creator and this very small, infinitesimally small, individuated creature. You're both of those at once. And the responsibility of creating the relationship, or the bridge, if you will, between the two, lies entirely on the part of the creature. That's the effect of free will. And free will is radical and at this point total. Whereas, for example, when you're in a finite mind and body condition, you can sort of lean back uh, into nature, into the society in which you have been incarnated, and you have a lot of context there that you don't have to take responsibility for, and in fact cannot take full responsibility for. Whereas in the domain of spirit, all of that has now kind of evaporated like the morning dew, and you are utterly, utterly alone facing the infinite.
It's interesting because we think of our individuality, our status as individual entities, as largely, maybe not completely, but largely defined by that agency, that free will. And yet, especially when it comes to spirit, like the potentiator of spirit seems like it's completely like on a different track than the mechanism of free will. As I act, as I think, as I believe, it seems like it's something that instead of me acting upon creation to effect, creation acts upon me, and I'm utterly subject to it. Is that somewhat like your interpretation?
Well, with regard to the potentiator, uh, uh, it's it's not the creation conceived as something external to me. Uh, when when dealing with the realm of spirit, it's all internal, and so uh, the suddenness and unexpectedness of the potentiator. In the card, it's represented as a flash of lightning. They often include the pyramid or a tower or something like that. I think that's very misleading because it can have a destructive potential. That's true, and you see the lightning strike the pyramid, and there's this destruction that happens. But the potentiator itself is actually just the lightning, just just the sudden stimulus. And uh, what's really arresting about that is the suddenness of it makes it completely unexpected, and therefore it seems as if it would be coming from someplace outside of me. But in fact, it's coming from someplace within me. And so it suggests a dimension of my own being that I'm not aware of having been responsible for conjuring up. It's just upon me before I have any basis for expectation. It's that sudden. And uh, what that means in a practical sense, as one moves into those more tractable uh, archetypes of catalyst and experience, is that uh, ca- catalyst is no longer something that I can get a handle on in such a way that I can create the conditions which draw to me that catalyst which befits my ongoing projects. So the effect of it is that at the level of catalyst, I am constantly being uh, thrown off my path. I'm constantly being dislodged from any sense of who I am. there's no sense in which I belong to a collective world anymore. This is the way Ra puts it. It's uh, a quite necessary portion of the adept's path is the dissociation from the miasma of illusion and misrepresentation. Now, what is the miasma of illusion and misrepresentation? It's everything that I previously associated with experience of any sort. I no longer can think of myself as the person I have spent my entire life becoming in relation to my society, in relation to the culture to which I belong, in relation to this planet.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And it actually has. I know we said at the outset that we weren't going to try and, like, tear apart these cards concept complex by concept complex. But it is striking that in the matrix of spirit, the figures are not just standing on solid ground; they're positively planted. They're as low. They're like low down. Their center of gravity is low, and if they're in the dark, they're also very fixed, right? Like they're not.
Are you referring to this card here?
Yeah. Whereas, like in the potentiator, like based on what you were saying, I noticed that those figures are completely off kilter, right? Completely, they're thrown off kilter. I know that the lightning is the most important part of that archetype, but it does strike me as, sometimes if I'm in a depression, what gets me out of it isn't necessarily even something that's positive. It's just something that, like, stops me from wallowing in this stasis that I'm in. You know what I mean? Just something to get me out of my. I don't mean to make such a shallow analogy, but I'm trying to think about this from a spiritual point of view in terms that I can actually talk about.
The archetypes of spirit are patterns for dealing directly with spirit itself. Now, there's a sense in which we always already have been dealing with spirit, but indirectly through mind and body. That's the typical way that incarnate experience unfolds. And as I've suggested, one already has considerable experience with various of the stations, the archetypal stations of mind and body, even before one begins a study of them. So there's a kind of resonance of recognition that takes place as one begins to get into that study. At least from my point of view, I've not been able to identify any correlated uh, experience when dealing with spirit. It's as if you enter this domain. Perhaps the best way to describe it is it's a very deep dreamscape, and the the images that populate that dreamscape must be seen as coming in an entirely internal way, because the relation of the creature to the creator in spirit is one of identity displaced. Identity displaced. So I am the creator, lost to itself. And that is such a disorienting feeling at the level of matrix of spirit that it's almost something sufficient to cause one to turn back, to not want to go there. because it's just too much to contemplate. But having said that, once one takes that first step and finds oneself in that abysmal depth of spirit, there's a sense in which one cannot turn back, because that experience will haunt one the rest of one's days, for better or for worse. So what tends to happen is that people that prematurely open that pathway to spirit can become very psychologically distressed, uh, even quite insane, because they structure the pattern of their future experience through mind and body in such a way as to create a block to that, because it's too terrifying. So they carry this terror with them. And the truth is, you have to enter into that terror in spirit in order to progress through it to the point where it's no longer felt as terror, but rather as joy. And that is a process indeed.
It reminds me of something I read in this book on Jung I'm reading, where he talks about going into the darkness, the blackness deep within himself, and just going further and further with the faith that he will eventually find some light, but no guarantee of that.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. Differentiator, pair that have sort of given us what we might say are the starkest, most powerful, imagery, so to speak, of what spirit entails. Excuse me. And just to be clear, you had said something earlier. This all relates, all of the spirit cycle, this relates to, in your view, the spirit complex in particular?
Yes.
Okay, so not spirit as some sort of like domain of like intelligent infinity, but like the specific shuttle between intelligent infinity and our complex.
Yes, but note that when you're talking about a shuttle, you have to understand that that works both ways. And all of the beingness of spirit is drawn from intelligent infinity. And it's only because of that that spirit, in its uh, overall sense, constitutes the gateway to intelligent infinity. So
Good point.
one is dealing with the energies of the infinite. And that means that it's both intelligent energy and intelligent infinity. That's a hard concept to grasp, but Ra says that explicitly. This is at the great way of spirit. And Ra will say that it's intelligent energy and intelligent infinity taken both together. So intelligent energy, remember, that in this context, that can be likened to prana. And intelligent infinity is that energy, if you call it that, which comes down from above, but which exercises its influence not by the push and pull of energy as we tend to understand it, but rather by drawing to it. So infinity draws us into it, and intelligent energy pushes us from down below, if you will. But those two ultimately are one and the same. They come into alignment or convergence in the great way of spirit. And that's the moment of illumination or enlightenment, if you will, the gateway to intelligent infinity.
Yeah, in that drawing and pushing dynamic, I almost see some sort of that almost calls back to the male female symbology in the tarot, but not explicitly in these cards, I should say. I think of that as a kind of ideal that both of which we have inside of us. And it's kind of interesting because in the Great Way, it's a female plucking the harp. Yet the harp has a male head, it seems like. It's almost as if spirit is working through that receptive ability of us to then play the tune that creates that male active principle.
Yes, that is an interesting observation, that the active figure there is female, and that which is acted upon is male. Yeah. It's almost paradoxical.
Oh yeah.
But
it's the actor in their primary role of receptor, right? Like,
yes.
which is interesting because that calls to that conduit metaphor of the spirit in the first place, that it is a conveyor of this stuff, right? Like
it might help to think of this issue in terms of the nature of desire, because it is desire which propels us along through our many, many incarnations, and which takes many forms, and which directs itself towards many objects along the way. And by many, I mean beyond count.
yeah.
But as you finally enter the domain of spirit itself, you begin to approach a point at which desire and its object are not two, but one. And it's as if my desire for the Creator, if you can put it that way, has finally reached the point where it meets with the Creator's desire for me. And that's the point of completion. That's the point of illumination. So I long since have ceased to desire anything of this world. But that does not yet mean, in spirit, that I have reached the point where there is union. Because I can desire states of my own being that are not yet completely unified with the Creator. So the desire has gone internal. It's been internalized. But it still functions in such a way that it falls short of the intelligence of infinity. And only at the end of the road, only at the Great Way, does that completion come about. That's a very long path, and And very few of us will get there
It doesn't even
in
seem
this
like a
lifetime.
yeah, it doesn't even seem like it seems like it breaks down the entire uh, metaphor of a path that we normally apply to our spiritual evolution as conscious beings, right? Like in the other archetypes, I may not see a sequence that follows this narrative pattern to a T, but I can at least understand my life in the resonance and the feeling tones of those archetypes. With this seems to gesture towards a path that I, as a conscious being, walk only in the most uh, like at a distance manner. Like it's as if I'm following a path whose boundaries I can't even see. You see what I mean?
Mm-hmm. When you think of value, uh, normally we mean by that we embrace a way of being or a system of desiderata, if we can put it that way,
Mm-hmm.
that structures what we feel we should strive for. And uh,
Yeah.
much of our experience is, in fact, defined by the tribulations of falling short of what we feel we should achieve. So, in other words, the very fact that we have a value already suggests a displacement within our own consciousness.
Absolutely.
And desire, as it matures and as it begins to detach itself from external objects,
Mm-hmm.
uh, it increasingly realizes that the dehiscence or the split between what it seeks to have achieved within itself and what it has achieved within itself is itself a function of the failure of the self.
Yeah.
So uh, we think of ourselves as working to perfect ourselves through overcoming that gap, which has registered to us as a failure. And so our desire is that you could put it in terms of healing. Our desire is that we should be healed.
Mm-hmm.
Our desire is that we should uh, already be that which we are aspiring to. But the very structure of aspiration works against that
Right.
because it sets something outside of itself and tries to move towards it.
Mm-hmm.
Only in spirit does it become possible for the object of desire and the desire itself to come into convergence. And that seems to be not a function of my own agency. In fact, it seems impossible that that could be a function of my own agency.
Right.
So I say, not I, but the wind that blows through me, or not my will, but thy will be done. One's addressing oneself there to God. So that structure of releasement, letting go of the very aspiration which has for a very long time come to define my spiritual work is what lies at the end of that long, long path. And as I understand it, and I'm speaking here now not as one who has attained that as a permanent fact, of my existence, but one who still aspires. Um, my understanding of that is that one gets glimpses of that state of affairs as one does work in meditation. And maybe for a time or two, one is transported into a realm of splendor. But one always reawakens to the reality that there is more work to do. And so, the great quest goes on.
I think I understand all that. um, Especially in light of what you said at the outset, that in the realm of spirit, there is no like distance between the two possibilities, the dichotomy of things. They're right next to each other. In fact, they're so close that they actually are the same thing. In it sounds like what you're saying is that in the realm of spirit, it is the work of recognizing the unity of these two things that present over and over and over to us as separate.
Yes. And so, in the final analysis, I guess that female figure is the appropriate way to represent that, if it can be represented at all, because there is a receptiveness to the infinite, and the infinite cannot be expressed except through the agency of the receptor. There's the harp, the male harp. But the spiritual melody, if we can put it that way, is one, the first moment of which has to be one of attending or hearing or reception.
Just by the mere fact that we are individuated. So it's incumbent on us to, this doesn't seem right, but it's almost like it's a releasement of that individuality in some core way that matters to us, that has sort of defined us for so long, right?
Right.
Yeah.
That's true.
I also want to point out the irony of spirit being this kind of not escape, but a change of one's attention from the worldly things, right, to that sort of like desire within, that goal within that's being reached for. And yet they call Great Way of the Spirit the world under tarot.
Well, you could call it the totality, or the
Yeah.
cosmos, or the all together. When you say all is one, if the two words have different meaning at all, it would have to be that you have the all encompassing of all individuation in a grand unity.
It's a summation and something much more than a summation at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Which is kind of what I sort of get the feeling from when I look at the Great Way and see that that those four heads in a circle. It's like these are all representations of all the possible faces of the Creator in manifestation, all available, all sort of brought together as that kind of unity of all. Animals. I mean, I don't know what the animals mean. I don't know what the human head means. I would offer a guess if I had any idea, listeners. I just don't.
I have always taken those to be the elements, earth, air, fire, and water, but I don't know why.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah.
Those, but the fact that all catalyst now comes from within when you're working at the level of spirit is what is responsible for the fact that when it comes to the experience of spirit, every last scintilla of the elements of experience can be brought to a state of illumination, can be redeemed. There's no residue. There's nothing left over. And so the way Ra puts this is striking. Even the most unhappy experiences which occur in the catalyst of the adept may, with the discrimination possible in shadow, be worked until illumination has occurred. And that is precisely because now in this realm, there is nothing in that catalyst which is extraneous to the process of assimilating it. Now, in the realm
Yes.
of mind and body, there always is that. One lives in a world. That world has all kinds of events taking place in it that are not within one's own immediate purview.
Yeah.
But in the realm of spirit, every energy that one works with is entirely within one's own purview.
And therefore, you don't have the convenient handles for those energies that body and mind afford the seeker.
That's right. And so if one is dealing with terror, if one is dealing with grief, sorrow, if one is dealing with pain of any description, it is the elements of its healing are present already in the nature of the catalyst as given.
Again, that gap is closed. There is no gap.
That gap is closed.
It's
That's
right there. And just a random observation, but when I look at the archetypes of the body and of the mind, I do not have the deep emotions that these spirit archetypes seem to, especially the images, convey. There seems to be something about this idea that our desire is so near to the object of our desire that speaks of emotion, in the sense that to understand an emotion, you have to fully feel it. There can be no sort of like, I'm going to keep this at a distance and observe it. That's not what it means to feel.
That's right. You're totally immersed in it. It requires a complete revolution in the point of view, and a lot of people resist that revolution because they feel you're somehow failing in your responsibility to the world. Carla, who was pretty deeply immersed in the realm of spirit through most of her life, put it in a certain way. She said that we are not here to fix it. We are here to love it. And a lot of people recoiled in horror at that because they feel like it's their moral responsibility to fix what's broken in the world.
Yeah.
But she put it at the level of, the deepest, most embracing kind of affect that you can, which is love.
Yes. If you're fixing it, you're operating upon it as an actor. If you're loving it, the activity is bound up in your very agency, in your very individuality, and there's no separation. And so it feels incredibly vulnerable, vulnerable, because you have it's almost as if we are instruments of the creator, we have sunk down to the root level of what it means to be an instrument. We are utterly subject.
Yeah, it's utterly vulnerable.
Yeah, like if I take forceps and try to like manipulate something, the whole point of the forceps is that that's not me. I'm not touching it. But if I'm the forceps and I'm the person using them, now what's going on? Like, I'm fully immersed in that, in the unity of what seems to be an activity of a subject on an object, right? It breaks
Yes.
down the subject object dichotomy. I guess that's one way of intellectualizing it.
And even if you try to put it as work that the self does upon the self, that suggests that dichotomy. And so
Right.
and you're stuck with that dichotomy throughout even most of the realm of spirit. And it's only when you finally get to the end that you realize the dichotomy itself breaks down.
Yes, and there's a hatan that talks about like transformation. I'll put the quote in the notes, but they say that eventually, as you're striving as a seeker, you realize that that which is sought cannot simply be like arrived at by you. You have to become that which you seek, and that's that transformation step that is inherent in the seeking in all of the cycles of the archetypal mind. It seems.
When we begin to study the archetypes, even the matrix of mind, we begin to come to the realization that the mind itself is infinite. It has, there is nothing which can bound it, that is unbounded. And yet, Ra will say, with regard to the transformation of spirit, the infinitude of spirit is greater than the infinitude of consciousness. For with disciplined consciousness, disciplined by will and faith, we enter into the possibility of directly contacting intelligent infinity.
Yes. Amazing. So I wanted to get back, if possible, to Catalyst of Spirit. Um, you had a interpretation of Catalyst of Spirit, sort of like in general, but I wonder what you make of the image, since it doesn't seem to me, Steve, it doesn't seem to like directly speak to the way that you were describing it. So I wonder if do you try to square that, or
You
am I
mean this
misunderstanding?
the image of this figure?
Yes, the two pictures.
Well, what I gave was the verbal quotes that Ra provided in the description of the catalyst of spirit.
Fair enough.
Uh, there's an interesting point that one could make with regard to the way these images work, and it's and this speaks to the whole question of what an archetype is in the first place. Now, Ra will say that the archetypes are Dingen an sich, things in themselves, and that refers, of course, to the philosophy of Kant. What is a thing in itself? For Kant, a thing in itself was a being or a dimension of being, I know not what, that by the time I have encountered it has already been structured by my ways of knowing. So the thing in itself for Kant is not knowable because I can only know through those patterns of knowing that I bring to the table when I seek to know. My very effort to know something structures that which is known. I only know that which is known as structured. that which is known is that thereby known, but also there is that which it is in itself is still unknown.
Yes.
And that is true of the archetypes, right? And so the images speak to those structures by means of which we can get hints or indications of how this particular archetype, which is a thing in itself, functions in relation to my capacity for taking up a relationship to it. So the images are hints or clues for how this archetype, which is not otherwise completely disclosable or representable in itself, may be worked with. All right, now, the images that we have are to some extent crippled
Right.
by two things. One, they were originally developed by Ra in Ra's third density experience, but then adapted to human experience using human images, and Ra themselves say they are not able to plumb the depths of our own distortions. So there's that leap, that gap from one modality of consciousness, which was that of Ra, to the modality of consciousness, which is that of us. And so that's one impediment in these representations. The other impediment is that these images were originally given to Egyptians who were absorbed in Egyptian culture, and therefore there are meanings that are typical to that culture, but which we don't necessarily share. An example of that is the use of royalty to suggest the ennobling, and that might not have that connotation to us these days in our cultural experience. Okay, so there's that. Now, having said that, I think there is less of that cultural determination in most of the spirit images of spirit. So the one that we're talking about here, which is that of this naked man,
Mm-hmm.
it's significant that the man is naked. In other words, when one's dealing with catalyst at the spiritual level, there one feels utterly and completely exposed.
Yeah.
All right, so there's that. Now there's that which flowers behind the back,
Mm-hmm.
and that which is uh, uh, before one. And so one is providing sustenance consciously for that which flowers behind the back. And the whole thing is subtended by what, the star of faith, is that what we call,
Yeah.
or
Hope. Yeah.
so there is that. But I still think that the most significant thing, indication that we have from Ra has to do with the fact that the catalyst of spirit is generated in the element of faith. And it is through faith that the process of dissociation from our worldly experience takes place. And it involves an utter change of viewpoint. And so the that which we nourish, which flowers behind our backs, in this state of being completely exposed, is a process which is not subject to the stimulation of outside forces.
Okay.
The stimulation is all internal at this point. And the energies that we are exposed to are the energies of the infinite.
And then there's the very pedestrian interpretation that the flowering is not being looked at, right? It's behind one.
It's
So
behind
one isn't getting the satisfaction of the fructification at that level. One is only seeing barren wasteland in front of one, right?
That's right.
And the same water pours out onto the barren wasteland as onto that behind one, which is fertile.
When that catalyst is resolved then into experience of spirit, we have what Ra calls the more manifest of influences upon the polarity of the adept. But here, Ra waxes very cautious because Ra suggests that, I mean, if you look at that image, you have this kind of the two polarities represented there.
Yeah.
And there's only this partially obscured moon is all there is to illuminate. And so there's an insidious danger, Ra will say, of how one interprets catalyst. One can interpret negative catalyst as positive and vice versa. It's oh so easy to misstep, Ra will say, to mistake one thing for another, one polarity for another.
Yeah, I think
and so
that, yeah,
one can achieve illumination, but one can achieve illumination along a path one does not intend, much to the detriment of one's polarity. And so
because it's so easy to make mistakes at this level.
It's not all peaches and cream in the realm of spirit.
Yeah. Yeah, that the scorpion definitely does indicate danger to me.
And Ra says insidious danger.
Yeah. Intuitively, I just feel like power. And I think this was actually mentioned in some of the work you and I were involved in last month at the 6th Channeling Intensive, that it's that power that spirit starts to make available to one that then is part of the temptation, maybe is part of the danger, that one can then act, that one can go back to the illusion of things acted upon and me as an actor, and then apply that sort of like superior vantage point. Okay, yeah.
Absolutely, and it's one who has opened the pathways to spirit will have available to one energies unavailable to others, and other people tend to sense that, however vaguely.
Yeah.
And you have thereby the possibility of influencing others in ways that you previously did not have, and in ways that you yourself might not appreciate. And you can be very far down a path that you first put a foot on in the self-assurance that you are being helpful, only to discover further along that path that you have in fact violated someone's free will and thereby taken upon yourself a huge amount of karmic responsibility. That's why that is so dangerous and so insidious.
Well, I mean, one way of looking at it is that it's all stuff that we need to learn anyway, right? If we're making this mistake, we obviously need to have that lesson. But at the same time, from the point of view of spirit, it must seem like a great, roundabout way to be getting where you want to go, right?
Well, to some extent, you could say that's true, but consider that when you begin to work in the realm of spirit, there's a magical charge to what you do, and it has an effect many times greater than the same kinds of activities which you might undertake prior to opening the gateway to spirit. And so the effects, both positive and negative, with regard to what you may do in the realm of spirit, are much magnified. And it's well to keep that in mind.
To be sure, I can't help but bring things back to all being well. So I'm like, oh, well, if I make a mistake, then obviously there's something that I need to learn, that my mistake is my entry into the lesson.
That's right.
But I hear what you're saying, which is that, Jeremy, at the level we're talking about here, these are lessons that are down to cosmic implications.
And even with regard to spirit, that's true. 100,000 incarnations later, it will all come out in the wash.
Exactly. That's what I mean. It's like at this level, what it means to have a sort of detour into learning is vast.
At this level, you could engage in an activity which would cause you, upon entering time-space at the dissolution
right.
of incarnation, to find yourself in negative time-space.
Do you sense some of that in the image of experience of spirit?
Yes, because it's a lot can be done working with these very refined energies with a candle in the darkest of nights. But under those conditions, it's, as Ross says, oh so easy to make a misstep. And so the net effect of it is that in the realm of spirit, the responsibility redounding to the seeker or the adept is greatly magnified. Yeah. And that's why once one reaches a certain level in the seeking, one does well to become very cautious in how one relates to others. And I have to say that some people have complained that I'm not very forthcoming in giving advice.
Who would have said that? I can't imagine.
And that's why.
Yeah. No, it definitely gives me a lot of food for thought in my own personal life. Yeah, I'll just leave it there. I don't think it's for public consumption, but I hear what you're saying. It's we're just sort of like going round and round this paradox, but the emotional, the sort of affective charge of all of this, like it's daunting. That's for sure.
And it's when one's dealing with affect that is so subtle, so nuanced, that the expression of that affect has the potential for affecting another at a level that that other is not able to address consciously. It can get back behind their process and create patterns, issues, conduct, which is something that they are not equipped to contend with. The fact that you have introduced this catalyst redounds to your responsibility.
Yeah. What I'm thinking about specifically, just to lay my cards on the table, is our, the project of the high altitude receiving center in general, and the kind of, I try to be friends to other seekers in one-on-ones that I have with them, but they're usually not. A lot of times people aren't thinking of me as an equal the way that I think of them as an equal. And that's on me if I have any kind of understanding that I wish to impart, which, what are our conversations but imparting these observations and these insights to each other with a kind of abandon, right?
Well, the
I mean, you
e-
don't do it with abandon. I mean, yeah, I see, but
equality is a funny thing because uh, there's a sense in which we are not all equal, and the deeper sense in which we are all equal. And negotiating those divergent levels, I mean, there are actually many, many different ways that these distinctions are expressed. For example, in dealing with you, there are some things that I do better than you, some things that you do better than I do.
right.
And life is full of these complexities. Uh, and so one always relates to others as people one can learn from, as well as people one can teach. And so that's all well and good. That's all fair. Uh, when one enters the realm of spirit, however, uh, there is a deep change in those dynamics because one brings to one's interactions a dimension that only another who has entered the realm of spirit can take uh, on the basis of equality.
Yes, because otherwise, if they're not capable of taking it on, they're going to take it on in some sort of misperceived way, right? And
Or
that's where all the problem enters in,
or indirect
or
way
indirect. Yeah,
that works in the unconscious, and one doesn't know how that will play out,
no,
and therefore one cannot take responsibility for it. One dare not take responsibility for that.
yeah. That's probably an area where my native egalitarianism works against me because I tend to want to speak to people. I hate being talked down to, and so I try desperately not to talk down to people. Um, and so I talk to them at a level where if they're not at my level, I expect them to rise to my level. I do that as a way of honoring them. But maybe this has given me some second thoughts about that.
Well,
That
it's an enormous source of complexity, I will
yeah,
say, because uh, uh, one seeks to be honest, and when a question is put to one directly, one needs to answer it as directly and as honestly as possible. Uh, but there are circumstances in which one does not lay all one's cards on the table.
yeah,
One waits. One waits for the question to come.
I'm reminded of this quote from this book that made a big impact on me. I'm a little ashamed to admit it. It's Celestine Prophecy, some pop new age book from way back when. But they were talking about speaking to children, right? How do you talk about difficult things in this world to children? And they said, you can't always express every idea to a child, but you can speak to them in a way that meets them at their level. And that is a subtle art.
Oh,
Because you have to reach deep inside your own grasp of the thing to its essence. And then you have to, so now you've detranslated it, right? You've gotten as close as you can to the Ding an sich, and you have to create a sort of version of it that can be understood by that person. And that's still a gamble. Just because you intend to do that doesn't mean you're going to do it effectively.
Yeah, Jesus spoke in parables, but when you read some of those parables, you wonder, what the heck does that mean?
Well, there was that part in the New Testament where he said, and then Jesus went and told all his disciples exactly what he meant in private.
Yeah, right.
So
But
not even they can figure it out. Yeah, they didn't tell us. Yeah, we're just stuck with Paul sort of trying to make it up as he goes along, right?
Yeah.
Well, why don't we move along to significator? What might you say? So this is the significant self in the spirit. And so the idea that you would have what appears to me in the image as a wand inside of a sun, this radiative sun, and then this symbol of magic with two.
Is that a wand?
That's how I interpret it. How do you?
I don't know. I do see the sun.
You could also see that it's a circle with a penetrating line, right?
Yeah, and it goes immediately down.
Yeah.
So what that means, I don't know, to tell you the truth. I do see the two polarities, male and female, are not unified, but working in cooperation or in tandem with one another.
Yes.
So, and they are within the magical circle.
Yep. There's something to be said for the male grasping a plant that has sprouted up, at least that's how I see it, versus the female, which is, it looks like she's holding a few of the flowers that ring them, does it not?
Well, I don't. It's hard to discern what she has in her hand. They do look vegetative. So
yeah.
And his looks vegetative as well.
Absolutely. Just his is still growing. It's in the ground. Hers is not. I mean, assuming that I'm correct about the interpretation of the image.
His is grounded, and hers is not. So she has something that he's drawn from the ground has been communicated to her, and she holds that.
Yeah, he has the bird on his chest. She has a very muddled. There's a very active pattern on her dress. I don't know.
The quotation that Ra gives in relation to this is, the significator of spirit is that living entity which either radiates or absorbs the love and light of the one infinite creator, radiates it to others, or absorbs it for the self.
The male, which is normally the active, one might say closer to the radiative aspect than the archetypal female, seems to be involved with the plant's growing. The female, which is typically archetypally, I need to say, archetypally associated with the negative, is harvesting things, is taking things.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah. we could circle this drain for a while. I know. I don't. With these archetypes, Steve, I find that I have to really sometimes start with the images in a way that I don't feel that way with body and mind.
Well, keep in mind that the representation here must include the possibility both of positive and negative polarity.
That's exactly what you got me thinking on. That's why I said the thing about the taking versus allowing to grow. Yeah. Okay. But this is the significant self of spirit, and there's a real sense of unification. And honestly, in my view, there's a sense of power that I get from this, that there's power here. That sun is so over the top. You know what I mean? I mean, assuming that that's a sun. Maybe I'm wrong about that. It's not quite.
Oh yeah, I think that is the sun.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
It's a very ornate and decorated sun. There's also this sense of now you've got me thinking of that line and circle not as a wand, but as a kind of center out of which something is coming, right?
Well,
there's the center, and there's.
I've taken it to be a pointer, and it points down here.
Yes.
It points down towards the created entities.
Yes. So that sort of gestures towards the shuttle roll in a way, right? In the sense that there is a directionality, there's a connective, a bridging quality, maybe. I don't know.
Coming down from above.
Coming down from above, right?
In this context.
Yeah, because as a significant self, that would probably be what's more apropos. How are you sort of like working with these energies coming down from above to either radiate them out or to use them as sort of like a center of gravity towards which you can attract?
Right.
Okay. I don't know if that's correct, but it sounds in the neighborhood.
But we have not yet got to the point of the opening of the gateway to intelligent infinity.
No.
So at that point, the significant self is utterly transformed. But here, the transformation has not yet been complete. And so the directional indicator is from top down.
That's really interesting, as opposed to the transformation of spirit, in which that top down is very much drawing up.
That's right.
It's very, very blatant that there's a drawing up being done.
Yeah.
I mean, transformation of spirit seems like it almost doesn't need a lot of explication from the image. It's so obvious what's going on.
Yeah.
A resurrection completely at odds with the a lot of the images up to this point are all, if they feature figures, they are figures with their feet planted on the ground. And here you have almost something rising into the air, like it's Revelation, right?
Yeah.
But only from a point of having been
answering to the
dead,
clarion
right?
call issuing from the central sun.
Yeah. Again, we're not in charge of it. It's happening to us. And I think that's very important.
Yeah.
And just in general, like a lot of what I think Ra's philosophy and Confederation philosophy always comes back to over and over again is having a cooperation between those aspects of ourself that need to act, decide, choose, and those aspects of ourselves that work upon us, but they're nevertheless us. Mm-hmm. Opening up to the fact that the creation works upon us just as much as we work on it, but there needs to be a balance between those two things. And in spirit, like we've been saying, that balance is not, the fulcrum of that balance is not so distant from the two sides. It's right up close. Thinking of a seesaw, you know?
Yeah.
um, all right. Well, we have touched on every single archetype here. Um, is there any kind of like summary thing you'd like to say about the spirit cycle?
Well, the summary is contained in the Great Way, isn't
Yeah.
it? And that does suggest a kind of directionality uh, of of the whole spirit cycle, in a way that uh, is different from what you get in the archetypes of mind and body. Uh, in mind and body, at at the level of the Great Way, one is one is often doing cyclical work. So one has taken up the work of matrix, potentiator, significator, experience, catalyst, transformation, uh, and in the Great Way, one goes back and does that over and over and over again. But when one reaches the level of spirit, there is a sense in which the ultimate directionality leads one to the opening of the gateway to intelligent infinity. And there's a kind of completion there, which is lacking in the archetypes of mind and body. It's a completion of the whole process.
Yes. Yeah, that completion is kind of hinted at the when in the model we've been discussing of this this a dichotomy that yearns to be a unity, right? It's like you've gotten as close as you can to separation being something that is useful for learning, and at some
And,
point you have to cross the threshold.
and uh, it's interesting that at one point Ross says that they themselves continue to work with the archetypes of spirit, and that struck me as somewhat odd, actually, the first time I read that, because uh, I was aware that the archetypes, as represented here in the Tarot, were developed by Ra and third density, and so much of the imagery that we get is third density related. For example, the imagery associated with the division between conscious and the unconscious, which in the higher densities is no division at all, although you do have a division between potentiator and matrix. So I did find it interesting that Ross said they continue to work with these things. At another point, Ross says that their hope, their expectation is that if they achieve graduation to the seventh density, they will uh, cease to be individuated in the sense that they will now have no memory, no identity. That all of that will be taken up into infinite intelligence, and so uh, that that would be an opening of the gateway beyond what we could contemplate here in third density. I mean, we might talk about illumination,
Yeah.
but not an opening of the gateway that has that level of implication.
It almost is like getting beyond the not me, but the wind that blows through me, but I have become that wind.
Yeah,
I am now, my identity has been able to expand to such a point that I don't need identity to be located in these discrete
well,
entities.
I don't even have it. It's
Yeah,
gone.
it's gone. Yeah, you're
Uh,
right. They say we will have no identity. You're right.
it's like a drop of rain falling into the ocean, it's now no longer the rain, it's the ocean.
Yeah. I hope that the listener and viewer can see that even though this is of great interest to me and Steve, we also feel completely completely unequal to the task of such powerful things. And I think that's kind of, I get the sense that that's sort of what the experience, not the archetype of experience of spirit, but just the experience of working with these archetypes of spirit. They always sort of put you back on your back feet and back heels, and you know, you always feel like you are stretching to your maximum potential just to be able to like brush up against them, you know?
Yes.
Um, so one thing I wanted to ask before we end the episode is, you know, we had this channeling intensive recently where we did try to, in my view, do some primary research for the first time since the raw contact on these archetypes. In other words, not us getting in there and trying to interpret things, but us trying to get out of the way and let some information come through for the first time in 40 years. Um, did you learn anything from this intensive that you could speak to about the archetypes?
Uh, what I feel that I learned registered more in the level of the affective dimension to me. Uh, it, uh, I have recently started working with the early archetypes of spirit in my meditations, so I had some preparation for that. But I was really struck just by the depth of the matrix of spirit, uh, just by the uh, enormity of the energy that involves. Uh, so it's hard to put in concept that which relates to spirit. Uh, one seems to be thrown back on metaphor, uh, and I think some of that came through. Uh, but I think the great impediment to attempting to communicate archetypes in general is that ultimately they are incommunicable,
Mm-hmm.
and that one is issuing an invitation to another to join one in the space of that archetype, but that each archetype resonates so uniquely in every individual that to give a definitive account uh, defies the imagination.
And I really feel like that's actually a really good way to describe how it felt doing this work last month, where we were kind of all in the presence of this great hope, this great expectation, this understanding that we are on the threshold of something that is truly useful in our evolution, and yet we sound like babbling babies trying to discuss it with each other. You know what I mean? Like all we can really do is just kind of like sit with each other and sit with it. And the moment we open our mouths, we, I don't know, I don't mean this to sound so negative, but it's almost like we pollute it by trying to describe it and discuss it. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
We can only distract and throw each other off when we do
yeah.
that.
It's for that reason that I shy away from trying to come up with one-to-one interpretations of every element of the images in the cards.
Absolutely.
I think one chases one's own tail in doing that.
Yeah, and there was one moment where Kuo even said, in discussing catalyst and experience stations, we just want to start from scratch. Can we leave all of this raw stuff behind a little bit and just let's just? It was like they were just sitting there. It's like, let's just talk, just like let's just start over. Let's inspire you rather than instruct you.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
I think artists understand this dynamic very well, that's a drawing to as well, in the sense that, like, I'm creating something that it either resonates something inside of you and it's yours that's resonating, not the artist, or it doesn't.
yeah. We philosophers and scientists tend to be way too literal, and so we have to rely on the artists to help us out from time to time. And
Yeah.
when it comes to the archetypes, that's pretty significant.
Well, trust me, we're all frustrated by that. Well, Steve, we've been going on for 90 minutes now. It might be time to wrap things up. Any final words?
No, I think we've done what we set out to do.
What we set out to do was to have a conversation about the spirit cycle of the archetypes. We had that conversation, but I hope that the listener and viewer can see just how incomplete this work is for all of us, and how the only completion that can possibly be understood and worked with is one that you would own, you yourself would own, that wouldn't have anything to do with what I have to say or what Steve has to say, or in some cases even what Ra has to say, but this own personal journey. So I would just you know implore the seeker to take all of this stuff with a grain of salt. All the stuff that we've talked about in these 3 installments on the archetypal mind are meant to inspire your own seeking, but you're going to have to get as close as you can to your ding on sich, your thing in itself. We're not going to be playing much of a role, and the words that we say are really going to play less and less of a role as you do that primary work of your own seeking.
Amen.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks so much for joining, Steve. This has been a really, really, I'm going to be listening to this talk a lot just to try to make sense of everything. And I feel like there's so much that went over my head, but that's what archetypal discussions always entail. You always feel like you're only getting like 1% of it. So thank you for your patience with me as we've gone through this journey.
And thank you, Jeremy.
All right. Well, listeners and viewers, thank you so much for sticking with us. This will probably be the last episode for the year. And I will be talking with Nathan and other members of the working group to figure out where we go in 2025. But thank you so much. And in the meantime, stay in the love and light.